Now, before we get into it all, Russell, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you end up here? Tell us about your relationship with the property market and what your involvement has been from a political perspective when it comes to property as well.
So I've always been involved in property. So literally since I was a kid, because my family have been estate agents since the 1950s. So my dad and his dad before him were estate agents in London and Essex. Pretty big business back in the 60s, 70s and 80s, which I went into when I left school. That then got me into a business called Emoov after I'd run traditional estate agency branches. So Emoov was one of the first online digital disruptor estate agencies. So I ran that for 9 years. So always been around property. I've done a bit of house building. I guess, look, it's fair to say, even though I say so myself, I'm pretty entrepreneurial. So I've been involved in property recruitment in the past and all sorts of kind of related bits. And then, yes, in 2006, I got involved, ironically enough, in objecting to a local planning application, which was, in my view, pretty onerous at the time. And I somehow came to the attention of the local council leader, who then asked me to stand as a councillor. I said no a few times. He got the big guns out, people like Eric Pickles and others to kind of, put their arm around me and persuade me. So I stood as a Conservative councillor and got elected in 2006. I ended up chairing the planning committee at Brentwood Borough Council for a period of time. I did that for, 2 terms, 8 years. Then, because of the age of my family and because of the business that I just started or was about to start, I stood down, kind of retired, so I didn't seek re-election. And then, lo and behold, though, 3 months ago, a collision of circumstances led me to go back into local politics. I'm a councillor in my home neighbourhood, actually, of Hutton South in Brentwood in Essex. And I now sit again on the planning committee. And that is quite an interesting dynamic, seeing kind of the planning consent process from a public sector perspective, and also seeing it as a private sector guy, as a property agent, as a developer. That I guess that gives me quite a rounded expertise. So the bit in the middle of that is that at Emoov, where we did our own PR after sacking about 5 different PR agencies for not being able to keep up, to be honest, I became very vocal, you might say outspoken, about certain aspects of the property industry and about the housing market, and ended up doing a lot of property commentary for the BBC, Sky, ITV, GB News, Talk TV, and so on and so on and so on. So I've done that for about the last 4 or 5 years, and that's then pushed me towards the political side, where I now do kind of paper reviews, political commentary, mainly for GB News, which is now, at most times of the day and the week, the biggest news channel in Britain. So it beats BBC News and Sky News, but also for what you would call independent media, which is those that have actually generally been cancelled by the mainstream media. People like Mike Graham and Dan Wootton and people like that. They have now got very, very successful YouTube channels. And so I do political commentary and a little bit of housing market stuff for guys like those. And actually, before people say, yeah, big deal, what do they get? 300 or 400 people watching? They get, between the two of them, so taking those 2 examples, Dan Wootton and Mike Graham, they get about 1 million views a week on their YouTube channel. So it's actually, in many respects, bigger than the mainstream media kind of terrestrial and digital TV channels.
I mean, that is certainly some CV. And this is why I really wanted to get you on the show, actually, Russell. Our paths obviously crossed doing some of these other interviewee bits and pieces for other networks and shows. And I was really interested in your opinions, which were very direct and not necessarily unique, certainly from my perspective. But I think the way in which you shared a lot of your opinions and spoke quite candidly about your thoughts on things, I think actually has become quite unique. We've taken quite a soft touch approach to things. Now, a lot of our listeners are obviously very active investors. And so listening to somebody like yourself, the opinions, the experiences that you've got is an incredibly useful exercise. And I think it helps us all make better and more informed decisions about whatever it is that we're doing as investors ourselves. So, I mean, with such a broad base of experience, I guess where I would like to start today is just from a very high level, Russell, what your opinion is on how different being a landlord is today compared to 10, let's say 15 years ago.
Oh, it's changed significantly, hasn't it? Which I think everybody on any side of the landlord argument would agree. I mean, look, I remember being a landlord, 20, 25 years ago. It wasn't quite unregulated, but it was a bit of the Wild West, wasn't it? In terms of there being a distinct lack of oversight, should we say, and regulation with regard to, condition and regulation around tenancy agreements and so on. And it seems that over the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years, it would be, so certainly since kind of COVID times-ish or just before, the landlord fraternity had become a whipping post, I think, for politicians. I think they see and have seen landlords as easy prey, easy meat from a cash cow perspective. And I get really angry about that. And look, I'm not a big landlord. I've got one property that I rent out, right? So I'm not a big, professional landlord like many of your watchers and listeners to this. But I suppose the following things have changed. So I think, first of all, certainly the regulation, particularly the Renters' Rights Act, which of course is now law, having taken many, many years over 2 successive governments really to kind of get to that point. Lots of tax changes, Section 24 in particular. And I think what I would say, turning the screws of, kind of vilification with regard to landlords being painted by the media but helped by government as pantomime villains. And I get very irritated by that because, my experience is about 96, 7, 8%, whatever it is, the vast, vast majority of landlords are good, honest people, probably not professional landlords. They might be HMO owners and they might have 3 or 4 of them. But, there's not all buy-to-let landlords, for instance, are making their entire living out of having 2 or 3 properties, which is the average. So you've got this kind of roll your sleeves up, semi-amateur class of landlord, which I think has been bashed every which way. And the irony, of course, is that a lot of those properties, whether it's HMOs or buy-to-lets that are in the rental sector, are doing a job that the successive governments, literally going back probably 20 or 30 years, have failed to do in terms of providing enough houses for rent and for sale per se, but also with regard to social housing. So, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of properties that are lived in by people that top up the rent with housing benefit. Well, that's because governments have not built enough homes. Actually, arguably, thinking about it, since the 60s, I think the last time we built 300,000 plus homes, which is the current Labour government target, was in the days of Macmillan, back in the 60s. So, landlords are trying to park their money somewhere that's, creative, interesting, reliable, and safe, only for governments to say, yeah, we don't like you very much. And actually, even though you're creating a supply of properties that we've neglected to for a growing population and 1 million people on the housing waiting list, we're going to continue to bash you anyway. So I'm really quite angry about it, actually, and that it's yet another area of government where you've got policy being made by people that haven't got a bloody clue about the sector, the subject in which they're making policy and regulation. So I feel pretty sad for landlords in that they are being squeezed and screwed completely and utterly unnecessary. But I think some of that is playing to a crowd. So certainly left-leaning governments want to see tenants as something to shore up as a sector because they think those tenants are going to be more likely to vote for them. They want to paint landlords as that pantomime villain because they're seen as kind of, do you remember Rackman? The slum landlords, that's the belief or the picture that's painted by government because it suits their narrative. And yeah, we kind of got it all around the wrong way, I think, really. To me, landlords should be encouraged by way of tax breaks, not tax hikes. Seriously, because of the risk and because of the service, I think that landlords are doing to Britain.
One of the questions I had for you today was about housing policy specifically, and whether or not any of this was driven by evidence, whether any of these decisions, whether any of these changes in legislation were really being driven by evidence. And I suppose evidence that would demonstrate some sort of productive outcome. So I guess we could look at Section 24 and maybe it did, maybe it didn't raise, as much money as they thought, but certainly it hasn't all been upside for the government. But, let's look at the Renters' Rights Act as another example, and lots of other changes that have come about and continue to, like you say, so beat landlords down. How much of this is being driven by evidence, or is what we're saying is that this is all vote spinning? Is this all just for the court of public opinion?
I think vote spinning an ideology. So, the ideology being, landlord bad, tenant good. There's a cash element, squeezing the landlord sector in terms of, doing away with the right to offset your mortgage interest, for instance, against income, potentially in the future, creating more and more taxation burden on income, on revenue, without taking costs, adding national insurance to rents from a landlord income perspective. All of that stuff is just designed to, prey on a sector that is big and is seen as prosperous. And of course, although it's big and it's got lots of money attached to it, there's a lot of landlords not making loads of money on a monthly basis because of those regulations, because of those costs. So I think there's a cost element. I think landlords are seen as a taxation opportunity by the Exchequer. But I don't think if it was an evidence-driven approach to the PRS, well, then the government surely wouldn't be doing what they're doing. They wouldn't be squeezing landlords so that there's potentially 100,000 landlords exiting the sector every year, because that's bonkers, right? Because we need that supply of properties because, as I've said, the government doesn't provide enough themselves. So the evidence can't be being looked at because of that kind of failed logic otherwise, I suppose. No, and I think it's purely ideologically based. If you look at a couple of things, first of all, EPCC, right? So EPCC, which is, they keep moving the goalposts, Andy, don't they? So I forget now, is it 2090 or something? I'm joking. When that's going to come in, that EPCC nonsense. It's for the birds on the basis that there's a large proportion of landlords' properties that can't ever get to EPCC because they're 100 years old, for instance, and they're going to, even if they did, it would cost 50, 60,000 pounds to remedy the fact that they're EPCE and to get them to EPCC. And the reason I think that's ideological, thanks to people like Ed Miliband, who has got this, to me, crazed fixation with net zero in a country that only emits 1% of carbon dioxide insofar as the planet's contribution to that total. Even if all landlords went EPCC, even if all cars were electric, even if we turned off gas and oil completely, which Ed Miliband wants to do, let's say we got from that 1% to our contribution being zero, what bloody difference does that make to the planet when China are churning out an increasing amount of carbon? So are the US, so is India. So that's why I think that, as an example, EPCC is purely ideological, but also Section 21 removal by way of the Renters' Rights Act. I get more and more angry when I hear politicians talking about no-fault evictions. There's no such thing as a no-fault eviction. What there is tenancy agreements coming to an end at the end of 12 months, and then month to month, and then the landlord deciding that they want to take the property back. But that's not throwing people out on the street. That's those tenants being outside the contractual arrangement of an AST. All the government had to do, I would suggest, is to allow regulation to include a kind of a deal between landlord and tenant where the AST could be as long as they wanted it to be, a bit like in Germany, where you can provide for things like rent increases based on RPI or CPI. You can have break clauses whenever you want. Allow the tenant, therefore, security of tenure for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or whatever, but have it as a proper contract, like a phone contract, like a contract when you go and buy a car or when you go and buy a house. Have a contract that both parties, tenant and landlord, go into with eyes wide open, that actually then protects both. That would have been the most sensible thing to do. Instead, we've had millions of pounds, loads of parliamentary time, and years of debate to actually solve a problem that was never a problem because, of course, most of the time, landlords aren't kicking tenants out on the street, particularly if they're a good tenant. So, long answer, mate, sorry, but pure ideology and playing to a tenancy crowd, and not just the tenant, but tenancy activist groups who I've crossed swords with in the past, by the way, and I hope some of them actually get to watch this because they're abhorrent people that are effectively Marxist types that genuinely believe that owning property is theft. As is the Karl Marx adage. Anyway, you'll get me on a rant if you're not careful. But yeah, look, so governments, and it's not just property, by the way, when it comes to energy, when it comes to defence, when it comes to all sorts of other things, particularly around things of an economic nature, governments are increasingly ideological and led by populism rather than conviction, if you know what I mean. So look, I can explore that all day, but we've only got 40 minutes or so.
Well, good to know at least that it's not just me feeling like this. And I think the picture that you portray, the landlord, of course, being the pantomime villain here, but also the fact that this is a pantomime. I think all of these different examples, demonstrate that so perfectly well. And I think when you step back and you look at it like that, it does actually start to make an awful lot of sense that this is just one big charade, and nobody really has a good gauge on what the consequences of all of this, materially speaking, becoming and are likely to become. Interestingly, you mentioned some of these left-wing activist groups as well, and I think that these are a dire consequence of this anti-landlord sentiment. Obviously, they are spearheading a lot of it, but only this week, I think I was featured in some article, if maybe for the Independent or something like that. And Acorn, who's a group I have no doubt at all you will have come across, the Acorn, had shared some.
I just suggest they're all nuts. There you go.
Yes, they are absolutely nuts, and they're not. It's not the first time that I've bumped into them as well. But there's a lot of this, and what I find kind of scary is just how much credibility they seem to behold amongst the general public. And that's a really concerning thought, because it's not just the characters like Ed Miliband and the Home Secretary making these changes, and hopefully they'll move out of office and someone can come in and reshape this. Actually, culturally speaking, I feel like there is a big and very deep-rooted problem now. And I suppose my next question to you, Russell, is there a way out of any of this? Like, does this get better at any point, or is this ultimately what we just need to accept and settle for and just get on with it?
No, I think it can get better. I think that there's a whole political analysis and picking through that I could now do in terms of all that's wrong with politics in Britain, and probably actually across the world, in terms of what I would call the vacuous, empty suit plastic politicians that are in place for themselves and are completely out of touch with the public. And that's why they don't make proper decisions, because they've often, certainly the Labour front bench, never had a proper job, never run a business. They just don't understand the real world. So I think, they need to go. And by the way, I mean, red, blue, yellow, green, the whole thing. I think any party that is made up of, people that have left university, gone straight into Labour or Conservative HQ, been a bag carrier, become a SPAD, gone for election as a little test, in a paper candidate seat, as they call it, done that, and then become an MP at the age of 35 with no life experience whatsoever, often either red or blue, coming from money. Those people have to be stopped, right, coming into politics, because they are the problem. It's not just ideology, it's the outrageous nature of their lack of life experience. So, look, I'm a bit biased because I'm a reform counsellor, right? So I'll try and park that to one side, where I believe that reform will deliver that change and will be authentic and are much more grounded. And believe me, I'm in that reform network. I meet people every day that are, door knockers, canvassers, leaflet deliverers, and, councillors, MPs and politicians that, mainly are very, very down to earth and very keen to deliver change. What I think needs to happen with property needs to be taken out of politics completely. So the supply of housing, as in new builds in particular, and to an extent regulation, needs to be incepted by those that are accountable to the taxpayer, particularly when it comes to social housing and so on, and, work to a mandate that perhaps is public sector led, funded, overseen, but actually are left alone as non-politicians, and not a quango as such. I'm not a big fan of quangos, but I'll give you an example. The problem with supplying enough houses in Britain, so we generally supply about 200,000 new homes a year. We need apparently 300,000, and a lot of that is because of positive net immigration. Think about that as you will, right? Whether that's a good or bad thing, right? I personally think we need immigration to an extent, controlled albeit. So we have a situation where no government has delivered enough housing, as I say, since the days of Macmillan, because it's used as a political football, and because no housing minister for 20 years has actually come from a housing or a property background. I mean, that's nuts. Man, that's absolutely mad. Imagine putting, someone in charge of surgery at Basildon Hospital, and they used to be a librarian or a carpenter. I mean, it's just nuts, right? It just makes no sense to me whatsoever. If you were to set up a National Development Corporation, which was a board of experts, so ex-developers, house builders, bankers, whatever, that had a mandate that they went to government with and said, this is our 10-year plan to solve the housing crisis. Sign it off, give us the money. We'll have quarterly board meetings so you can hold us to account as civil servants and politicians, but you mustn't get involved with this every 3 or 4 days trying to make a silly announcement as a politician to make yourself look good. that actually, when you take the politics and the grandstanding and the football, the political football out of housing, would be a big, big step forward in terms of solving a lot of the problems we've had. So what I'm saying, Andy, is that most of the problems we have in terms of particularly housing provision in the UK, social housing in particular, is because it's something that is used as that political football, as a means for gratuitous headlines that give a politician credit. That's got to stop. And mate, do you know what, mate? Maybe I should become housing minister. I'm serious. Because I would, in a future government, to say, look, stop the bullshit. I don't care about the headlines. I care about the solution. And judge me on that in 5 years' time, right? Not a housing minister that's only got 2 years in position, typically, that needs to do all this quick stuff to make it look good, but never follows through, never actually gets delivered. Yeah, I mean, for instance, your viewers might not like this very much. I advocate bringing back council housing. There are 3,000 houses built in 2004 by councils. There used to be 300,000 council houses built. That would solve, with help, with guidance, part of the social housing problem, because you'd make it the responsibility of councils, however many of them there are, 300 plus borough and district councils, but also they would then be judged politically at the ballot box in each instance if they hadn't delivered enough in that area for their local housing waiting list need. Anyway, just some ideas as to how we might solve it.
Very interesting to hear these ideas. You'd certainly get my vote, Russell, as the housing minister. I'm sure you get a few from our listeners as well. So, maybe think on that one. And actually, on your point around social housing, I agree entirely. I think that one of the big solutions to the big problem we have has to be a ground-up solution to more homes. And actually, social housing is a very deep-rooted problem, and the lack, rather, of social housing. And the big problem at the minute is that the pressure to, in many ways, deliver that housing is applied to the private developers who've got to make their own schemes economically viable and somehow pay for this social housing, which I may have shared this on the podcast recently with, some of our listeners may have already heard this. I can't quite remember, but I recently signed off a Section 106 agreement, and in that was a large payment towards affordable housing. In principle, I have no issues with that so long as it doesn't undermine the viability of my scheme. But what did really frustrate me was that in that Section 1 agreement, the council tried to get me to agree that if in a certain amount of time, I think it may have been 5 or 10 years, they didn't apply the amount that I was going to pay on that Section 106 to social housing, they could use it for whatever they wanted. It could just be thrown on the bonfire. And of course, I said, not in a million years am I going to agree to that.
Completely wrong.
I think that, this is the sort of the approach that on a local level is being taken. Clearly, there's not enough accountability to take, some of the resource that we do have and turn it into what we actually need. I see that there's a real breakdown at that kind of fundamental level as well, which is obviously, well below where the governmental decisions are being made. But
I'm afraid you've got a lot of council officers and civil servants that aren't in any way accountable. They're hidden. They're not elected. Doesn't matter what happens. They're not going to lose their jobs. I mean, I don't think council officers, civil servants ever get sacked anymore because everyone's too scared of what they might do litigiously. I'll tell you a very, very quick story. Let me tread carefully here. I am aware of a local authority in Essex that some years ago, I asked that local authority a question with regard to some odd stuff in that authority's accounts, and it related to £600,000 worth of Section 106 money that had been sitting in the bank for quite some time. Or rather, it was on the accounts as sitting in the bank, but it wasn't in the bank. So I asked that chief executive at the time, where's the money? And their answer was, we're not sure. Wow. So I said, okay, well, first of all, we need to go public with this because this is effectively taxpayer money, right? It's designed to assist the taxpayer with whatever it was going to be for, play area, social housing, part of the school, whatever. And there was huge resistance by that administration to go public and to make themselves look culpable, even though they were culpable, or certainly that council, maybe a previous administration was. That got covered up. That was never made public, that money had gone missing. And I further asked a question, because as I understand it, Section 106 money has to be ring-fenced and used for its purpose, except if they can coerce an agreement like you've just outlined. And I said to the chief exec, is there a possibility that it's been used for the wrong thing, i.e. for paying salaries or for paying for something other than the purpose for which it was intended. And that chief executive said to me, yes, that is very possible. So now multiply that across, then there's 440 councils across Britain, including county councils. Now try and calculate, envisage how much Section 106 money that is supposed to be there for good intentions has actually been lost, forgotten, or wasted, or misspent.
I mean, it's a pretty scary thought, but I think we can conclude that it's probably substantial and is certainly not helping.
Billions. I think that the civil service, frankly, needs to be turned upside down and shaken. And there has to be a swathe of change within the civil service because they're not accountable. They're not doing, and I'm not saying everyone, but generally as a generic, they're not serving the taxpayer well. It's very, you're probably too young to remember this, but yes, minister. Very yes, minister. Those that are watching this and listening that know what I mean by yes, minister and yes, prime minister will hopefully now be smiling at the thought of the fact that the reality is government and local government are run exactly as that sitcom back in the 70s portrays.
Well, this is an interesting conversation because I guess more to my point, I do wonder whether or not these issues that are so deep-rooted can be fixed. And with my investor cap on, I'm always looking for ways to make my business operate as best as it possibly can be, as profitable as it can be, provide the best services for our customers, our tenants. And, listening to you talk about this stuff, I think underlines a lot of what many of us and our listeners are thinking and are concerned about. I've got a specific question about HMOs, Russell. And we've talked obviously quite openly about the opinion towards housing, towards landlords, but specifically focusing on HMOs for a moment, what is your thought on the broad opinion on HMOs in the housing market at the minute? Is it obviously, I think there is a narrative that draws into the immigration crisis to an extent, certainly in some areas, but also I think that there is perhaps a broad misunderstanding about what HMOs are, from the lay individual. What are you seeing?
So I think HMOs need a bit of a PR rebrand. I don't quite how you do that, given that, how many people make up the HMO sector. I don't know, 500,000 people. HMOs, I think, had, and I say had rather than have, a bit of a grubby reputation, for being a kind of hastily concocted, partitioned 1930s, 3-bed semi somewhere that now sleeps 9 people kind of thing. I think, it's the old, again, I'm going to use a 70s analogy, sorry, but I'm that old, a rising damp type analogy where, regulation is ignored and it's all about packing as many people in as possible. So I see through my endeavors, so my traveling around and media and so on, and also some of the software providers like Coho, for instance, that, I've been quite close to, so Van there. And it seems to me that there is now a developing HMO kind of product that is potentially much more upmarket. It's much more polished. It's much more professional, dare I say. But I think the HMO sector as a kind of headline, as a brand, does need a revamp so that, like it is in the US, single family occupancy as such, it can be seen as not only something that doesn't have a stigma attached to it, but also something that's incredibly investable. Now, your viewers and listeners to this will be saying, yeah, we know it's investable. It's great because we get a much, much better return in terms of yield on an HMO than if it was a buy-to-let. Notwithstanding, there's extra kind of operational kind of friction that goes with it. But I think if HMO status can be elevated and polished a little bit in Britain, it becomes ever more investable. It becomes, on more people's radars in terms of that yield. And I think that's good, particularly if you get, and again, this might not be popular, some institutional landlords coming in. So, they're already in build to rent. We hear that they're already buying up swathes of properties as buy to let. Maybe to an extent, if an L&G or a BlackRock or an Aviva or, I don't know, a Granger decided to get into kind of very ordinary, inverted commas, HMOs across the country, but professionalize them. So there's a standard, right? They've all got en suites or whatever it might be. They've all got a certain level of standard and quality, I think that would do the HMO sector the world of good. So yeah, I think the only way is up, I think is what I'm saying.
That's certainly good to hear. And I think I can imagine a lot of our listeners are probably sitting thinking, well, from their perspective, the HMO market is all high end. That's what we see on Instagram, it's what we see on Facebook, it's what we share inside our community. But it is worth reminding everybody that we represent, our community, our listeners, the people doing the sort of stuff that we're doing, we still do represent a very small fraction of the housing market, and actually more specifically still the HMO housing market. There are still a lot of landlords that have inherited properties in locations, large portfolio landlords that have never really reinvested in that sort of stock, and has caused a lot of problems. I've seen it firsthand on the ground in local authorities that I've been operating in, and that is ironically where 85% of the council's attention goes to, but ultimately it's the other 85% of good landlords that end up having to pay the consequences of that through more administrative costs, which trickles through as licensing fees that they're able to justify, more enforcement notices, additional local regulation above mandatory standards and things like that. But I completely agree and implore all of our listeners and community members to just keep doing what they can, showing off their work and developing good relationships with their tenants. I think a big part of this actually is now almost a generational thing. I think if tenants who are typically of a certain age come and experience a good living environment and a good sort of landlord-tenant experience, they will take that on. And actually, that will help over a number of years. And it might take quite some years, but that will steadily help change the opinion as well. And I think that is one of the really important solutions to this problem, as well as some of the other ideas that we've talked about. Russell, I don't want to get into the detail of the Renters' Rights Act today. We've done it on the show before. I'm sure you're already bored to death of talking about it. But now that the dust has settled, now that we know that it is happening, what do you think the tangible, unintended consequences that has been overlooked at government level will actually be for the housing market? I'm talking about for property values, for tenants, for landlords, for housing supply, all of that stuff.
So the biggest effect, so I actually think the effect in terms of landlords exiting, I think we've probably seen that in anticipation of what looked like a very, very scary bill, particularly when Labour kind of dialed it up after taking the baton from the Conservatives. It inarguably got worse. I don't think now you're going to see an exodus of landlords leaving, because I think although it's a bit onerous, and as I said earlier on, the government has unnecessarily kind of poked a stick at landlords. I think the consequence probably is that you're not going to see tenants leaving willy-nilly. You're not going to have an issue in terms of tenants and pets and tenants on housing benefit that otherwise you might not have wanted, and so on and so on. So I don't think we're going to see a huge reaction by landlords that's negative to the sector. But there is one consequence which the government has definitely overlooked. So it is a great question, and one that probably is overlooked by many people, particularly in government, and that is the effect on the court system. The nonsense in that act, which states that you can't be made to pay over the advertised rent of that property, and that there has to be, on an annual basis, the rent can go up, but it can't go up by more than market. Well, who's going to really regulate that? What happens when there's a dispute? In fact, I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen. Landlord seeks to put up rent by 3%. That's about right, 4%, whatever. Tenant disagrees, decides to go to tribunal, multiply that by, I don't know, conservatively, a third of all tenancies that change hands every year. So I think there's about 3 million tenancy transactions a year. So you might end up with 1 million extra cases going through the housing courts, the tribunals, where not only is that going to clog up that process, that legal process, but how on earth is a judge or a tribunal of magistrates going to settle on what is a fair market rent, particularly for something that perhaps doesn't have any comparables? So that whole court thing is going to, the court system is going to break. It's under huge pressure in general now in terms of our justice system, but the property side is going to absolutely break. In about a year's time, we're going to start hearing from government, from David Lammy, if he's still in place as Justice Secretary, that, we understand there's a problem now. Well, yes, it's one that you should have foreseen. This is what we're going to do about it. And I don't know what they're going to think the answer is going to be, but I'll tell you one thing: it won't be sensible and it won't be adequate. So what you end up with is landlords in 2 or 3 years' time that have tried to honestly and with good intention and legitimacy put the rent up mildly for that tenant, as is their right. And you have a lot of landlords that are stuck in that court process system at great cost. That's going to be an issue. So I don't think the Renters' Rights Act per se, an EPCC and, all the other stuff that's happened in the past, Section 25, I don't think they're the issue necessarily. No AST terms anymore, being made to take basically any tenant that, kind of faces up to you. The court system is going to be the bit that is played. So tenants will play the system and gets clogged up. I don't quite know what the answer to that then is in terms of what landlords will do. What I hope doesn't happen, kind of in deference to what I just said 5 minutes ago, is that landlords then don't say, okay, now I'm taking it back. I'm now going to evict the tenant, which I'm allowed to do if I either want to live in that property or I want to sell it. And maybe that is the straw that breaks the camel's back in 2 or 3 years' time, because landlords will feel completely helpless in terms of tenants clogging up the system and not paying an additional rent. The same applies, by the way, to rent arrears. If there's rent arrears at the same time as all that's going on, then you're going to see a horrendous choking, a bottleneck of those arrear cases being seen and heard by courts as well. So you call it unintended consequences. This should be foreseen by a government that is a government of 2,000 or 3,000 people, SPADs, civil servants, and so on. You'd think there'd be a brain cell between those people, wouldn't you? But clearly not.
Well, precisely. And, I often find myself pondering just how poorly thought that this has been, or is there something that I am missing completely that they're fully aware of? And is it the very fact that, they are quite happy for that straw to break the camel's back, and actually there will be some magic alternative solution to the private landlord? I mean, I genuinely don't know. And I agree with you entirely on the pressure that will be placed on the court system. I've got a letter from my desk here about a particular tenant in case an arrears is at £16,000 and it's taken, I think somewhere up to maybe 9 months just to get this far. And I know that we're going to get awarded that and costs, but this particular tenant just won't have the means to pay for it now because it's been left to go on for so long. So at the end of the day, whilst we will win in court, we haven't won at all.
Yeah, which to that Renters' Rights Act, Andy, there should have been a bad tenant list included as a provision where you can have a list that obviously with evidence and merit, you can add like a credit report on bad payers. You can have a bad tenancy report. So if that tenant has misbehaved, antisocial behaviour, or hasn't paid, there should be a separate register of poor tenants so that as a landlord, you can search that register and say, right, okay, well, Mr. and Mrs. Jones are terrible tenants, it seems. Well, I won't accept them then. I mean, what's wrong with that? If we can do it with people that don't pay their car finance or their bank loans, I mean, why can't we do it with, crappy tenants?
Well, and there is going to be one for landlords. Landlords are going to be on a new register. And, I mean, there's just so many different facets to this and so many different problems I think are going to find their way of washing out in all of this in reality.
The good thing is this government, and again, I'm being purely political here, and I think my view here is shared by about 80% of the country. This government in 2029, or maybe before, depending if there's an economic collapse, I mean, they will not get re-elected, whether it's Andy Burnham, Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting or Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party. There will be a new show in town, and I suspect whoever that is, and I hope it's Reform, whoever that is, it will see a lot of changes to specifically landlords, amongst a million other things. But if I have my way, believe me, one of the first things we'll do is to roll back some of this ridiculous legislation, start again, but do it in proper consultation with landlords, people like you and Ben Beadle and so on, and actually do something that is foresighted, sensible, and that actually meets the benefits and needs of both landlord and tenant on a proper balance. So this is temporary, I think is what I'm saying.
Well, I think that will, whilst it doesn't necessarily solve the problems that we're dealing with right now, give a lot of our listeners a lot of reassurance. One of my questions today for you was, what do you think the future looks like? And I think you've probably answered it in a roundabout way there, Russell, which is this is transient and it almost certainly will get better. And I think I agree with you because it has to. it can't not get better because there has to be a solution to the private rental sector. It's not something that we as landlords just decided to make. And it's not just the case, despite the narrative in the public domain that if all the landlords disappeared, the housing would suddenly be cheaper and everybody could afford to buy their own house. That's clearly not actually the solution to more people getting on the housing ladder. We have to build more homes. But it is reassuring at least to hear that this is more likely to be temporary than anything else, and that this stuff, a lot of this could be changed in the future. I think this has been a really fascinating conversation, Russell, and I'm sure for a lot of our investors who listen, the landlords that listen to the show, who are thinking about the future, there's plenty of food for thought here. I mean, in fact, I've got another question I want to ask you, but before I move on just from the Renters' Rights Act yet, and on the point of unintended consequences, can we just on the tenant specifically for a moment, is the tenant the ultimate payer here, Russell? Because as I look at this as a landlord and I look across my business and I think, well, there's more risk here now and I'm paying more for that and I'm getting less, back into the account after I've paid all my tax on that. That's got to come from somewhere. Well, the only place that it can really come from is the customer that we we operate, with, and that's the rent going up. Yes, there are going to be some controls on that, but is this obvious or is it not obvious?
There's definitely an element of this being counterproductive on the basis that, landlords, whether they're small, medium-sized or institutional, need a return both on capex and on yield, right? So if that return is too small to counter the risk of being in that space in the first place, then people are going to exit, or indeed, yes, they're going to have to increase rents, which means that the tenant ultimately pays more. So the tenant's bound to be the ultimate payer, right? So if all those landlords are in a place where they're disadvantaged, then they're going to squeeze the tenant, and the tenant is going to be the one that's disadvantaged. And it's a captive market, isn't it? So don't forget that there is always this debate about whether people should be a tenant or an owner. And some people choose, right? So some people choose. I mean, at the moment, although I own a property that I rent out, I'm currently renting myself. I'm actually a tenant, but because I choose to, because I decided that I didn't want to pay $100 worth of stamp duty on a house a couple of years ago, that I'd wait for the market to settle, which was the right decision. But my point is, I'm making a choice to be a tenant. Not everybody's in that position. So a lot of people that rent, as we know, arguably particularly in HMOs, are in a position where they have to. So if rent prices went up across the board by, as we saw kind of during and post-COVID, by 8 to 10% per annum, those tenants have got no choice but to pay that money, right? Or to move 100 miles further out where perhaps the local economy and the kind of property market dynamic is different. So of course the tenant's the ultimate payer. But somehow we've got to get away from this notion through the media and politicians that the landlord is squeezing the tenant either to be vindictive. I mean, that just doesn't happen, or they're doing it to make huge profits. Now, I've long been an advocate of this phrase, which is, profit's not a dirty word, right? There's nothing wrong with profit. Profit makes the world go round. Capitalism to me is not just a wonderful thing, but it's bloody essential. Otherwise, we would still be, I guess, in mud huts and, using horses to plough fields for our food. So capitalism should be embraced. But there's a misconception, of course, that a landlord that's seen a 3% rise in their property value every year for the last 3 or 4 years, and maybe a 3 or 4% yield after costs and God knows what else, that they're fat cats, and that's what needs to change. Quite how we do that, I don't know. Again, I'd come back to the employing a good PR agency, which would be me, by the way. So there's my plug.
Well, Russell, I mean, before we wrap up, I'm going to implore you to leave us with some inspirational words, some words of motivation and encouragement, during these challenging times for our listeners who are building their portfolios, who are passionate about this, like I am, who want to do things in the right way. What advice would you share right now? What should they be doing? What should they be thinking about? How should they be approaching their businesses?
Okay, so look, I think firstly, just be patient because, as you said, as we've said, things will change, right? And if we end up with a more entrepreneurial government, then I think landlords get the benefit of that significantly. I guess the other thing is, despite all we've said, and there is a lot of doom and gloom around the PRS and HMO investment because of that repeated clubbing of the landlord by successive governments. When you actually analyse property as an investment versus a lot of other things, so whether it be precious metals or the FTSE or, mixed funds or whatever, even what I call alternative investments. And funny enough, I did a video on this recently, looking at things that were a bit out there in terms of investments. So things like classic cars, number plates, Birkin bags, wine, whiskey, and so on. Seriously, all of those things provide you a decent capex return, but obviously none of them provide a yield, really. I mean, obviously stock market investing does. You get a rise in share price and a dividend. When you strip everything else away, despite the pressure on landlords, despite, increased cash collection by governments, and despite increased regulation pressure, investing in property is still a very, very good thing to do. So it might not be brilliant like it was, we said at the beginning of this conversation, Andy, 20 years ago, right, where it was the Wild West and to do what you want and it was all great. It's gone from being brilliant to good, in my opinion. So, and here's another quick analogy. I did a thing at the Property Investor Show, which I'm very involved in now, back in October, I think it was. And I hosted a panel that was about the buy-to-let market. And there was a guy in the audience right at the front. He got there early. He obviously wanted to have a bit of a go. And I don't know why he wanted to have a go at me because I'm a massive landlord supporter. But anyway, he said, look, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm a landlord. I've got 7 properties. I'm being squeezed. He said, excuse me for swearing, I'm pissed off with this. I'm going to sell the lot. And I said, wow, okay, that's quite a big move. And this was all, this was a few months ago, obviously, before the Renters' Rights Act actually came to pass, but there was a lot of noise around it and a lot of negativity. And we kind of debated for a couple of minutes about the rights and wrongs of investing in property and whether the sector was dead or not. But here's where I got him, right? And here's the logic. I said, okay, so you've got 7 properties. How long have you owned them? And he said, oh, since the 90s, most of them. He said, I picked them up over the last 20 or 30 years. I said, okay. And you're working out yield and future capex based presumably on the value of those properties today. What would happen if you went back and actually worked out your capex increase and your yield now based on what you actually paid for those properties, whether they got a mortgage or not, took off the interest and so on? I said, firstly, I suspect your return on a property you bought 20 years ago that's now worth 300 grand and was worth 100 grand then, you're now making a yield based on that 100 grand, which is 3 times better or thereabouts than the yields you think you're making because you're basing your yield on today's value, right? So that's an amazing return that you probably haven't really thought about. I said, but also, let's say you sell your 7 properties. Let's say they're worth 300 grand each. You're going to end up after fees with 2 million quid in the bank, unencumbered. Great. Where are you putting the money? I said, you've got to pay CGT. Secondly, you're probably going to pay tax on the way into any other investment. You put the money with Hargreaves Land down, they're going to charge you 3% to manage the money. They're going to do that again after year 1, again after year 2. If you put it into most things, you're then on the exit going to pay CGT again. So you're going to pay CGT of 40-odd% twice. Now, do you want to still change sell your portfolio? Guess what you said? He went, okay, I'm going to think again. So in a very long-winded way, Andy, that is a lesson to people that have owned property for a long time that are moaning about terrible governments over the last 6, 7, 8 years where landlords are concerned. But put it into context and perspective. It ain't that bad.
Do you know what? I think that is a perfect way to end the show. You can be a testament to this. I didn't ask you about anything in advance of recording this. I didn't try and influence any of your answers to any of these questions. And I think you've summarized that perfectly and exactly how I feel about Russell. You've got to have a long enough time horizon, opinion and view on investing in property. If you don't have that, it's not the right investment model, in my opinion. Look for some returns that you can maybe crystallize in a shorter time frame. But look at historic performance, look ahead. Everything has changed. Nothing is quite as good as it was a few years ago. You only need to go into the local shop and pick up a cream egg to see that it feels a bit smaller in your hand than it costs more. Nothing is quite as good as it used to be in property,
Sure.
Is one of those. But what else are you going to do? Okay. And it's still asset backed. It's still secure. We're still an island. We still need housing. People still need to live in it. Good quality accommodation. Actually, despite all of the noise, good tenants do value good quality accommodation. And I think there's still a really important role and a really rewarding role for people like us to deliver that in the private rental sector. Russell, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. For anyone who wants to find out a little bit more about you, maybe come and keep an eye on what you're doing, follow you, come and listen to you in other places, or maybe even hire your PR services, where are they best to go to?
So I'm probably most contactable on LinkedIn. So just search my name on LinkedIn. I'm on there a lot. If you want to get involved in a more political stance, then that's X, Twitter, where I tend to have a few bun fights on a daily basis with people of a political persuasion. So yeah, contact me. And if you want to get in contact direct, DM me through LinkedIn is probably easiest.
Thank you very much, Russell.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me.